Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Strength and Hormones podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Papanos, and today I have a special guest. We're going to be talking about circadian rhythm, and I'm so excited to have Sarah here. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Lo. I'm so excited to be here.
Yay! Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your practice.
My name is Sarah Marlette. I have my master's in functional medicine and human nutrition. I am a certified nutrition specialist and an LDN, a licensed dietitian nutritionist. And I always say my passion grew from pain. So growing up, I dealt with all the issues from weight issues to acne to irregular cycles to digestive issues. And it wasn't until later in life I made a career change and wanted to get more into the holistic space to not only help myself, but help others heal. And in graduate school, I became obsessed with circadian rhythms. And I was like, why aren't more people talking about circadian rhythms, especially as it interfaces with female hormones and it impacts things like our sleep and our mood and our skin and our digestion and our blood sugar, all of which tie back to hormones. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk about, some tools that your listeners can add to their toolkit from a nutritional standpoint.
Yes, I agree. I think it's such an underlooked piece of things. And there's so much research in this space that just really isn't being talked about. And it's also such a free tool that, as we'll talk about, right, that can be optimized for many people. And maybe we can talk about, like, for shift workers, what to do in that type of situation. But it's such an amazing resource and it plays such a big role in hormones and really everything within the human body, right? So, maybe for those that have not heard the term circadian rhythm, could you just tell us a little bit about what circadian rhythm means?
Sure. So I always say think of a circadian rhythm as a natural rhythm. Circadian rhythms are physical, emotional, mental, and behavioral changes that operate roughly on a 24-hour cycle. And they impact almost everything from digestion to mood to blood sugar to, our response to body temperature to our heart rate. And nearly 80% of our cells are circadian. So it really impacts almost every aspect of the body. And to keep it super simple, when I work with clients, I say, think of circadian rhythms as routines. Your body thrives on routines. So you mentioned something about like, oh, we could give tools for shift workers. And before we started recording, I said to you, like, I'm operating as a shift worker right now because I'm a new mom. I have a 4.5-month-old. So sleep is fragmented, meal timing's a little bit off. So I think sometimes we don't realize that a lot of us are walking around living like shift workers, though we're not working the overnight shifts. We're not maybe nurses or doctors or firefighters or flight attendants or whatever it might be. So I'm excited to kind of get into some of those more realistic tools, but to circle back for a second on circadian rhythms. So they're natural rhythms that influence so many areas of the body. And we have something called our suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is sort of the timekeeper for these rhythms. And it's the CEO, and it's located in our hypothalamus, our brain. And one of the best things we can do to support our circadian rhythms is making sure we're getting that morning sunlight every day, which tells the CEO, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that it's time to wake up, it's time to do its function. So if we think about really basic things that we can do to support our body every single day, the morning sunlight, which for some people seems so trivial, can go such a long way.
It makes such a difference in how you feel too. And I think a lot of people experience that, right? Once they start adding in the morning sunlight and, energy levels and mood. And obviously you start to see it in like your cycles and things as well, which we'll talk about. So other than light, what else either positively or negatively influences our circadian rhythm?
So many things. So research shows that light is going to be the biggest external factor, but it also shows things like our food intake, our meal timing, our stress, our physical activity, our social environment, our temperature can all have a really big role. Meal timing can be a really big one. So when we break our fast, what time of day we're eating. So I mentioned briefly how blood sugar is circadian. So I talked about how we have this central clock called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and then we have something called peripheral clock, circadian oscillator. So basically what that means is things like digestion, pancreas, liver, your intestines, your skin. These are all have a strong circadian role. So if we think about what can impact it and how meal timing impacts it, erratic meal timing has been shown in research to disrupt our circadian rhythms. Things like eating really late at night and potentially skipping meals and having long gaps between meals can disrupt our rhythm. So not only can, lack of sunlight, but just our routines being all over the map. So I said earlier, circadian rhythms, think of routines. When our routines are all over the map, this can lead to internal circadian disruption. And in the literature, it's called social jet lag. So even just the weekend can throw things off. And with the, I say like on social media, like sometimes people hate Mondays because their circadian rhythm is disrupted. Sure, there's other factors, right? But research shows that the things we do on the weekend can increase things like depression and anxiety and mood disorders. So if you're already, trend towards anxiety, if your circadian rhythms are disrupted from erratic meal timing, going to bed later, waking up at different times, even things like temperature, your room's too hot when you're sleeping, all of that can disrupt your circadian rhythm, leaving you to feel less than optimal.
So it's that variability then you're saying in terms of like when we're eating or when we're getting light exposure and darkness that can happen a lot of times on the weekends that then impacts mood regulation. Is that right?
Exactly. And there was a really interesting study. So there's something called melanopsin in your eye, and it's basically this protein sensing guy. And what research has shown too is a lot of times, like especially if you're on the East Coast and like I am, and in the winter it gets really dark, if you stay indoors and you don't get that sunlight to sort of trigger your body to like wake up and do its job, this has been associated with increased anxiety and depression. So we talk a lot about like, how in the winter people become depressed. It's also synced up to your circadian rhythms, that lack of sunlight. I
Yeah,
mean, I know I feel like in the winter, like talk about
totally.
or like when the sun's away, like what a difference.
Yeah, everyone's happier in sunshine for sure, right? It's why we live in tropical islands. How long are we talking about? And then in what time frame of waking are we looking at for sun?
So, what research would suggest is upon waking within like 15 to 30 minutes, you want to go and get direct sunlight for about like 15 to 30 minutes. Here's the thing, because you might maybe you live in Scandinavia, or maybe you're like me and you live in Buffalo, New York. In the winter, that's not always an option. So I say like a great tool then, or if you're a new mom and maybe you're waking up really early and the sun's not even close to being out, using something like a sun lamp can be really helpful with a minimum of 10,000 lux. Again, to trigger, think of it as your CEO, but that suprachiasmatic nucleus, which basically just tells the body like, everybody, it's time to check in. Who's ever supposed to be working right now, it's time to clock in, and everything starts to rev up, including digestion, including appetite, blood sugar strengthens, all of these little things.
Okay. And so for someone like you, maybe who's a new mom and you're probably waking up in the middle of the night, I'm assuming if you wake up at like 4 a.m. to feed your daughter, but then you're going back to bed and you're not like legitimately waking up until say like 7 to get going for the day, would you say that that light exposure at 4 a.m. and again at 7 would be essential? Or is it like try to kind of do the 4 a.m. situation like it is still dark, try to keep it as dark as possible since you are going to be going back to bed, and then 7 would be like your initial wake up period?
Exactly, because what can happen? I mean, unless you want. I mean, I know some women are like, "I'm going to get up at 4 and I'm going to start my day." I am not. I'm going back to bed, so I don't want to get my cortisol morning awakening response crossed over. I want my body to I do everything in the dark. So Margot, my daughter, we've got like a little red light. So any night feedings, everything's in the dark, very dim. So babies' circadian rhythms develop, for the first 4 months of their life. So keeping kind of in mind, like they associate the dark with sleep, just like humans. So I wouldn't do that until I'm fully awake. So then I put her back to bed. I get up at 6. I start my day, because that sunlight helps to trigger and helps to sync up your cortisol response too. So if I did that light low and then I like tried to go back to bed, I'd probably just be like laying there and I'd be like, physically, I'm so tired, but mentally, I'm alert.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So you're trying to keep it as dark until you're like ready to go for the day.
Exactly.
Got it.
Unless you're ready to get up at 4 a.m.
Yeah, exactly. No, and it's crazy too. Like I was listening to this podcast when I first got pregnant about the impact of the circadian rhythm with oxytocin and how much of an impact this makes on labor. And one of the reasons why like they recommend, not having your baby with like bright lights on, as in like what generally happens in hospital settings. Like moms always historically have kind of gone into more of like a cave like type situation to have their babies, like all animals do. And how the circadian rhythm influences the oxytocin, which I thought was really fascinating. And I also was seeing that like there's some impact even during pregnancy that, babies' circadian rhythms, I believe, is like opposite of ours. Like they say that they're generally most awake when you're sleeping. But I'm assuming like they also have circadian rhythms too when they're in utero. Can you share a little bit as to like the role of maybe pregnancy and like labor and just like that whole birthing process and circadian rhythms?
Yeah, and so research shows that when they're in the womb, so like, I mean, you might feel like your baby kicking a lot in the evening, like you said, like they're flipped. They haven't really dialed into that circadian rhythm pattern yet. And research shows that around 8 weeks, their cortisol rhythm starts to kind of come into play, and then it kind of matures, throughout 4 months. And the first year it really develops. That's so interesting what you said too, though, about giving birth in like a more calm, darker room too. Like that's what a lot of like Chinese medicine and acupuncturists will say too. If you think
Mhm.
about the bright lights too and how that kind of releases that cortisol response, that stress response, keeping it dimmer is really important for those, if it's part of their birth plan, I should say, too. Everybody
Mhm.
has different things that they want to focus on. So research has shown that postnatally, the babies, I think I said this, their cortisol rhythm starts to develop around 8 weeks. So if you're a new mom like me, you might notice like baby sleeps like their rhythms are so off when they're first born. Like they'll sleep in bright daylight, and then as they get older, and they talk about the 4 month sleep regression, when they start to be kind of become aware of the night and day cycles, they call it a permanent change. Then during that time too, you really see such a difference. And like, oh my gosh, at least for my daughter, like Margot needs to be in a dark room. If she sees the light, she is like, it's time to get up, it's time to play.
That's crazy. Yeah, and I've even heard too that like breast milk can contain like melatonin and things. So like if you are going to be, pumping and then giving breast milk, like make sure that you're giving what was pumped like in the morning time the next day versus like pumping in the morning and then giving that bottle in the evening time.
Yeah, isn't it wild? I mean, I wouldn't say like I'm not an expert in that area, so I wish I could add more onto it. But I think it's just so interesting, and it's really just interesting too. Like as she gets older, and for those who with kids like listening, like I notice like if we get out first thing in the morning, Lo and I both have German Shorthair pointers, so we have to get the dogs out. So right out with like Sydney, I mean, it's so much easier. And who knows, maybe people could, correlation doesn't mean causation, but it's so much easier to get her down for naps. It's so much easier to get her in the succinct rhythm when we get out first right in the morning after I feed her.
Yeah, I believe it. I'm so sure. Dogs have circadian rhythms too, right? So
Yeah, I
we're not
know.
the
I
only
feel like
ones.
totally. There's no stronger rhythm, I feel like, than a dog, right? Like
Yeah.
if I'm a minute late for breakfast, it's like the house is on fire.
So you mentioned there's a link between that morning light exposure and cortisol and something called our cortisol awakening response. Can you talk a little bit more about how circadian rhythms influence cortisol and then how that maybe conversely influences our sleepy hormone melatonin?
Yeah, I like to keep it simple. So I tell my clients, think of cortisol as the sun and melatonin as the moon. And I feel like on social media now, there's all these like quote unquote cortisol coaches that are like, you don't want any cortisol, like lower your cortisol. It's like, we want cortisol when it's in an appropriate balance and it's appropriate rhythm. So cortisol is circadian. So if you have trouble waking up in the morning, this could be a sign that your cortisol pattern's a little bit out of sync. What gets us up in the morning to feel that bright-eyed, bushy-tailed feeling is that release in cortisol, right? It kind of tells everything to turn on. As the day goes on, our cortisol, if it's in a healthy rhythm, right, comes up and then it naturally comes down. So melatonin can be released. If cortisol is high, melatonin can't be released. So we want to make sure there's a balance between the two of them. And so a lot of times when people are like, I can't sleep at night, I'm never tired, I'm always feeling wired, that's a clear sign that your cortisol is dominant over your melatonin. So it's more about getting it in its appropriate rhythm than doing all these like random protocols to like lower and get rid of your cortisol, because when it's in its rhythm, it's not only anti-inflammatory, but it also helps to support your metabolism and fat burning.
Hmm. And you mentioned red light and using that in the like darkness and more evening hours. Is there a relationship between red light and melatonin or this cortisol relationship?
Yeah, and then taking it a step for yeah, so red light is beautiful. I love it for mitochondria, kind of helping to support that melatonin release from your pineal gland. But even more so, and it sounds so trivial, so when our body sees that blue light in the evening, it tells melanopsin, which is a light sensing protein in your retina, like, oh guys, it's time to turn on. It's time to be alert, which can suppress the release of melatonin from your pineal gland. So get off your phone. I mean, like, I know nobody wants to hear that, and people love to scroll on their phone, right? Like on TikTok or whatever. But that blue light you're getting, even with your blue light blocking glasses, there could still be some, is telling your brain, that melanopsin, like don't produce that melatonin. Red light's beautiful, like lighting candles. Another really great tool, if you feel like your cortisol's all over the map, is potentially having some healthier, like increasing your carbohydrates at dinner, pairing them with a protein to help to lower that cortisol so melatonin can be released. There's a gentleman named Dr. Sachin Panta out of the Salk Institute, and he has some really interesting research on that as well. Also, not making dinner your biggest meal and your latest meal. So if you think about melatonin too and cortisol, how these also impact things like digestion, in the evening your body starts to turn down, and things like your pancreas and even receptors in your digestive tract have receptors for melatonin. So just like our body is supposed to naturally get tired in the evening, so are our internal processes, right? So blood sugar starts to wind down. So I mentioned earlier how we have these circadian oscillators. So things like your pancreas and your liver and your digestion, so they're operating on this clock, and they want to break just like we do. Like nobody wants to be responding to their boss at like 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. Sure, sometimes it happens, right? Sometimes late night dinner happen, but we don't want that all the time because we want to be able to turn off and rest, as do these functions. So not only adding some carbohydrates at dinner, if that's appropriate for you, but also trying not to make dinner your biggest and your latest meal, which can tax digestion and then impede your sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. No, those are such great tips that I think are really practical for a lot of people too. And maybe sometimes we don't see the impact of that because I think so often it's just about like, am I eating healthy? Or like, am I eating, so many people focus on like calories and things like that, that have such a trivial role when there's like these master regulators that are even more important than those little details of like calories and things like you're mentioning, which of course are still important to some degree, but like maybe not something we should be as focused on, right?
Totally. Oh my gosh, I feel like I wish you could like scream that from the mountaintops. I always say, are calories everything? No, but they are important. But what research has even showed that potentially has a larger influence on things like thermogenesis. So it's how your body's sort of breaking down and metabolizing, fiber, protein, all of these things, carbs, fats, is when you're eating. So I always try to tell clients, like, what a really easy tool you can do that's free. You don't have to buy a supplement. You don't have to go to Whole Foods to get something, but try making breakfast and or lunch a little bit bigger and dinner a little bit smaller. There was a study that was performed, and I feel like you've probably shared this too, but in women with PCOS, that showed that when women ate a bigger breakfast, smaller dinner, they ovulated more, they had improved androgen levels. There was also a study performed in obese women that showed when, they were both on isocaloric diets, so calories were the same, they controlled for the variables. The group who had a bigger breakfast, smaller dinner lost double the amount of weight and improved really important cardiovascular markers, blood sugar. And like, just what a free tool. But also I think, and you're saying this too, like we're not saying like never have a late night dinner and like never live your life and travel and like celebrate, but it's really like more about what you do consistently that can really move the needle. And then it also, I feel like, allows you to do a little bit less in your life. Like you said, you don't have to be obsessively weighing your almonds or, obsessed about all these little things. By working with your body's natural rhythms, it frees up, at least for me, so much mental space where I could focus on other things, like other things that filled my cup.
Yeah, I agree. And I love that you mentioned that too about having like carbs with protein at dinner, because I think that there's uh, a lot of people that believe that you should not have any carbs with dinner, right? Because you're going to like automatically store them as fat or something. But when we look into the research, right, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but from the research I've done, fat oxidation, so your ability to like burn fat, is what drops in the evening time. And the carbohydrates, like you said, are what help lower that cortisol and help make more melatonin, right? And so are we thinking about this like backwards in terms of what the macronutrient balance of dinner looks like?
I feel like we are, don't you? I feel like so many women I talk to are like, well, I'm not having carbohydrates at dinner because that's going to make me fat. And then I'm
Mhm.
like, well, you're not sleeping. And there was an actual study performed in a sleep lab that showed a reduction in sleep lowered your resting metabolic rate. So is it the carbs that are making you fat, or is it our inability to kind of sync up with our rhythms?
Love that. Okay.
I used to be that girl. I'd be like knocking the rice out of my husband's hands, like no carbs at
Yeah.
dinner. Just because I mean, we're fed, you hear these things, and a lot of times people have like millions of followers, and you're like, this has to be true. Like,
Mhm.
and it's just like, now I kind of use this expression, like, you wouldn't take legal advice from a non lawyer. So why are you taking nutritional advice from a non dietitian, somebody who has no idea what they're talking about? Because nutrition is a science. It's not this like little trend. I feel like anybody can say anything now, and people are like, that's it. Like, I have to do what they said because, they have so much engagement, whatever it might be. And it's just like, it's the Wild West out there with nutrition advice.
It really is. And it does create a lot more stress for people. A lot of times, like I have clients come to me, they're like, I saw this on Instagram, I saw this on TikTok, and like all of these like conflicting things and all of these different ideas. And I can just like imagine how that overwhelms your brain and makes your brain want to feel like it's going to explode.
Oh my God, totally. I mean, sometimes like people send me things and I'm like, wait a second. Like there's this one woman like saying like collagen's associated with something. And I'm like, what is going on? Like making these false claims and like limiting your ability to comment back on the post. And I'm like, if we're just gonna like make things up, like I'm just gonna be like the Buffalo Bills like won the Super Bowl, like you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
other people are making like what is going on? And honestly, like some of the things people are like suggesting is harmful for women and their female hormones, which I
Mhm.
know like, but it's just like, and now that I have a daughter, I'm really like, what is going on?
Yeah. Yeah. You're like, please guard yourself.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
I want to get into the relationship with circadian rhythm and our sex hormones. I know you mentioned about that study with women with PCOS that I think is such an important point to bring up. What in general, maybe even just outside of PCOS, like how is our circadian rhythm influencing things like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone levels?
So this is a really great question. And so I don't want to get like too okay, let me just like lay the groundwork and then we can kind of get into some tools. But we know that the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis is kind of what helps to govern our reproductive system, our reproductive axis. And it is circadian by nature. Taking it a step further too, we also know that our ovaries are circadian by nature, and things like our uterus and our ovaries have circadian clocks. So if you've ever traveled or you've ever altered your schedule, you might have noticed like your period was late, your period was different, it was heavier, maybe you had a little bit more acne, and this can all kind of tie back to that circadian disruption. So if we think about circadian rhythms, we're also thinking about, and I won't go down a rabbit hole, I promise, but we're also thinking about infradian rhythms. So men operate off a circadian rhythm, which is a 24-hour rhythm, and women operate off an infradian rhythm, so our menstrual cycle, which, we'd say a 28-day cycle. Obviously, there's going to be variability based on the individual. So what we're seeing in research too, and I said this earlier, you don't have to be a night shift worker to live like a night shift person. Like I'm kind of like in the weeds right now with the newborn, but how, poor sleep, I think it was shown to reduce the output of FSH by 20%. There was another study that showed flight attendants and those who were working night shift had a 15% decrease in fertility. And so if we're thinking about kind of what's going on, we think about sort of this hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis and how it functions in a timely manner with our circadian rhythms. So how we operate and when we operate out of sync with these rhythms, research is now suggesting, well, they don't, it's not like we have the exact mechanism for how this is occurring, but this is impacting fertility. This is impacting our hormones. This is impacting our menstrual cycle. And since we're so programmed to live in a circadian rhythm lifestyle on this 24-hour rhythm, sometimes we don't take into account like our feminine energy and how that shifts on the infradian rhythm. So not only can our infradian rhythm impact our circadian rhythm, but our circadian rhythm can impact our infradian rhythm because we think about the ovarian circadian clocks, how our uterus is impacted, and then how gonadotropin releasing hormone is also in a circadian pattern and how that releases FSH and LH. So I just throw out like a ton of big words there and somebody might be like, what is this woman talking about? Basically, when we disrupt our circadian rhythm, we're disrupting our infradian rhythm and then vice versa. So the more we can live in alignment with our circadian rhythm, the healthier we are. The more research shows improved fertility outcomes, decreased miscarriage rates, improved ovulation, better menstruation.
Mm. Yeah. So infradian rhythm is kind of applying to our cycle, right? Is what it sounds like. And then you're saying that if our circadian rhythms get disrupted, then that can then influence our cycle rhythm, this infradian rhythm.
Exactly. And the easiest thing to think about, if you've ever traveled, like, and you've changed time zones and you're supposed to get your period, it might be a couple days late. And you're like, what's going on? Like, why is my period late? It's because our uterus and our ovaries have circadian clock genes.
Mhm.
And so the more we continue to disrupt it too, the more we can kind of get out of alignment with this infradian rhythm. And I don't think we think about it. At least I didn't for a long time. I thought, why is my period so wonky? We don't realize like the last 100 days can impact your current cycle. And that can look like staying up really late, skipping meals, erratic meal timing, all of these different things, over exercising, which can create that cortisol response, at an inappropriate time. And I don't think, at least I didn't for a long time, though, like think about how much that impacted like my hormones and my fertility journey and my thyroid and all of these things.
Totally. Well, and I think it's starting to die down, but there was such a trend with like intermittent fasting for so long, right? For a lot of women. And as you mentioned, the timing of when we eat heavily influences the circadian rhythm. So do you believe that by intermittent fasting, where people are skipping breakfast, maybe not eating till like 12 noon, that could be then impacting sex hormones through the circadian rhythm in part?
Yeah. I mean, I was such a hardcore faster that I never lost my period, but I started to have anovulatory cycles. So I stopped ovulating. And it
Mhm.
took me a long time to put together that I was living like a man. So, and then my TSH went from like a 1.2 to a 3.4. So your thyroid stimulating hormone, right? Released for your listeners. I always say like that gives you a good gauge of what's going on with your stress, but it's also circadian. Your TSH is circadian. So I like in my late 20s, early 30s, like was straight up like living like a man. And I was like, well, I didn't, after a while, I didn't feel great, but I was like, I quote unquote look good. So, but then I stopped ovulating. My basal body temperature stopped increasing. My period started to get really long. I was like, let me get some blood work. And I was like, oh my God, my TSH went from like a 1.2 to a 3.4. Like, what is going on? And, deep down, we know, right? It's like, I feel like intuitively I knew, but I just kind of kept pushing against that gradient until I was like, well, I'm not getting any younger and we want to start a family soon. Like, I need to get my stuff together now.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's usually how a lot of times these like, abrasive dietary modifications I feel like work is that people usually feel really good initially, and then it's like after 3, 6 months of more of this like chronic depletion of the body that now you start to see the hormonal ramifications. Because as you mentioned, like these things don't just happen immediately, generally speaking, right? It takes some buildup for us to see your endocrine system, your hormones get derailed.
Totally. I always say the hormones are their last to adapt too. So I did feel great. I was running off what I call these stress hormones. So that false high where I was like, why isn't everybody doing this? Like I feel so good. I was just like zooming around doing everything. And then the burnout started to come in, right? That subclinical thyroid started to hit me, but it wasn't right away. It was like 6 months. And I see this so often with women, or they'll message me, they're like, well, I'm doing this. And I'm like, well, hit me back in 6 months or like even a year and let me know how you're still feeling. Cause I was that girl that like was living and dying by like this fasting app and was like, I had cracked the code until I didn't.
Yeah, until you crash and burn, right?
I was like, "No, I'm losing my hair. I'm not ovulating. I'm like, what is going? I was like living like a man, I say. Like
Yeah,
Stacey Sims always says, like, women are not small men, but I was
yeah.
literally straight up living like a dude.
Yeah, I always say that you can't outsmart your hormones, It's like we think that we can like out fast and out calorie and out exercise and do all these things and not think about our hormones. But at the end of the day, those are like the master regulators of how everything in our body communicates. And you mentioned a little bit about how just like some of the fasting and things really disrupted your thyroid. Your thyroid started to slow down because that TSH was increasing. So, what are some of the other ramifications that we see with circadian rhythm? I guess both positively and negatively influencing other hormones because we don't just have sex hormones, right? There's other hormones like thyroid hormones and insulin and hunger hormones and things that are all really important to this conversation. So, how does circadian rhythm influence those other hormones?
So things like our pancreas is our circadian oscillator and our peripheral clock. And there's really good research showing circadian disruption increases your risk for metabolic syndrome, things like type 2 diabetes, things like insulin resistance. So there was a study that showed like meal timing and when you're eating and how you're eating, if you're skipping meals and eating your biggest meal at night was increasing the risk for insulin resistance. So we think about again the peripheral clocks, your pancreas, all of that, how that influences your blood sugar. If we think about things like your thyroid too, we're thinking about the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis and how that is synced up to your circadian rhythms, and TSH operates on a circadian pattern. So there was a study that showed, so it operates on a diurnal rhythm. So basically there was a study that showed that your TSH, your plasma levels in humans like increase throughout the afternoon and then peak at night, and they're lowest in the morning. when people were chronically sleep deprived, they had double the amount of TSH, their plasma reading, than the people that weren't sleep deprived. So that kind of shows you the little things. And I mean, we could even take it a step further too, because then if your thyroid is off and you're sleep deprived, how is this impacting all of the other circadian oscillators? How is this impacting things like digestion, right? So your digestion can become off if your circadian rhythm's disrupted, which means you're not absorbing the nutrients you might need for your thyroid, which could lead to constipation. So how are you getting rid of the excess estrogen, which can then impact the thyroid function and can impact your liver pathways and detoxification? All of these different things. So your thyroid is circadian, your blood sugar is circadian, and your hunger hormones are circadian too. So we get hungry around the same time throughout the day. It's an anticipatory response. So the body revs up ghrelin, which is kind of our hunger hormone. Leptin also, which helps to kind of keep our appetite in check, is also a circadian hunger hormone. So one thing that really got wonky for me when I was like fasting long hours and doing all these things is like my appetite became completely muted because I really wasn't eating, because my fast became so long that I wasn't kind of getting that cue from ghrelin that you're hungry, right? So it's good to feel hungry around the same time of the day, because this is your body starts to prime itself. It's an anticipatory response. Ghrelin revs up, your body realizes like, okay, this is when Sarah starts to eat. As a response to this too, meal timing can help to improve blood sugar, because then your pancreas is like, oh, okay, cool. It's about the general time she eats. So it improves things like blood sugar. It improves things like, the release of your digestive enzymes. All this means is it's just helping your body work better, work smarter, not harder, because you're in this rhythm and your body now anticipates this rhythm, improving all of these functions.
Mm,
So I kind
yeah.
of went on a tangent there. Sorry.
No, that's so good. And as you mentioned, all of these hormones are interconnected. And I think that so often the way that like our Western medical system treats things, right, is that everything is disconnected. It's like you go to a gastroenterologist for your gut issues, you go to an endocrinologist for your hormone issues. And maybe you even go to a different doctor for like your thyroid issues than you do for your, insulin and blood sugar related issues, right? But everything is one connected system. And as you're mentioning, is like if your gut and liver clocks get off, then that then influences your sex hormones, and then that influences your thyroid hormones and influences your blood sugar, and they're all one interconnected system.
Which I think like I wish like, and I'm whatever, you go through all these journeys in your life and I'm so happy for where I am, but like God, I wish somebody would have just like said that to me too, like when I was in it, like not like fast more, do this more. And I just think we don't realize like how these like little things can impact that. There was a study in 2016 that found shift workers were more likely to have elevated TSH and be diagnosed with subclinical hypothyroidism than non-shift workers. And
Mm.
so I think, like I keep saying this, but like so many of us live as shift workers. There's a great book called The Circadian Code by Dr. Sachin Panda, who's one of the leading researchers in the space of circadian health. And he kind of starts off the book saying we are all shift workers, like most of us are, unless like you're in the blue zones. And I think that was a topic they didn't touch on in the blue zones, was kind of like how succinct they are with their rhythms, right? But we kind of all are. I've gotten in such a bad habit because the monitor's like next to my bed, like being on my phone if I think my daughter's waking up, and I feel it. I mean, I see it in my Aura ring, I see it in my HRV, and it's like I think sometimes like it's like we have to just take a step back and be like, let me just get back to the basics. It's the non-sexy foundational things that really move the needle. It's we don't have to biohack. Get out, go get your morning sunlight, eat around similar times, get off your phone at night, right? I mean, we could get like super granular about like the best time to exercise. I'm not an athlete. I'm going to move first thing in the morning. That's what feels best. If we just get back to basics, and when you work with your body, you truly have to do less. You don't have to try so hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've mentioned a great couple of tools there within that. Can we break it down as like a guide for people, for those that have the ability to, they have a 9 to 5 job, maybe, they're able to wake up in the morning and follow some of these, like, I guess, normal circadian rhythm principles, like you've mentioned. And then also on that flip side, for someone that is in this shift worker type situation, like a true shift worker, right? Or someone who is awake during the sleeping hours, what are some things that maybe we can just start with that they can do in the morning time?
Okay, so this is what pre-baby, like this was like my magical circadian setup, which was quickly humbled. But I'd wake up, I would have some type of mineral drink. I generally don't like to eat before I walk, because I like to actually sit down and have a proper breakfast and not be rushing. And I have a German short hair pointer who like is like, we're getting outside. So, I'd have some mineral drink, whatever it might be. We'd go out, we'd get that natural sunlight right away. Even on cloudy days, you're still getting lux. So lux is a unit of light. And there's a free app, I think it's called Lux Reader. So I live in Buffalo, New York, where we don't see the sun like super often. And people are like, oh, I'm not going to go for a walk, it's not sunny out. You're getting more sunlight than you think. So that would be wake up, get outside and get those negative ions, which help to support your cortisol response. If you're like, it's snowing, it's raining out, what am I supposed to do? I don't want to get outside. How can I also help to improve my cortisol morning awakening response? Wake up, do 10 jumping jacks, take a short cold shower to kind of increase that cortisol, make you feel awake in the morning. Open all of your windows, open all of your blinds, and if there's still no light, sit in front of that sun lamp, roll out, do some yoga. Maybe you're getting ready, a sun lamp with a minimum of 10,000 lux. I generally suggest, everyone's different, right? Your hunger hormones are going to be a little different. Eating breakfast in 1 to 2 hours of waking up, maybe it's 30 minutes for you, maybe it's 90 minutes, maybe it's 2 hours, whatever it might be. What I find works really well, this is a tool, not a rule. It might not land for you. You don't have to put it in your toolkit, but is doing like a higher protein, fiber breakfast, and a little bit lower carb, not low carb, but like fiber rich carbohydrates to sort of keep that cortisol rhythm in sync. So maybe it's some fruit in your smoothie, or maybe you're doing some some buckwheat in your Zen basil seed pudding. I don't know what you're having, or maybe you're doing like some Ezekiel toast that's a little bit more high in fiber, and then focusing on eating around similar times throughout the day. This doesn't mean you have to eat every single day at 9 o'clock, but kind of, research shows not pushing it too long, maybe eating, within a variability of like 9 to 10 or 10:30, or if you're waking up early, 7 to 8:30, just because of this predictability. These circadian oscillators then, right, they start to have an anticipatory response when the rhythm is consistent. They start to anticipate like, oh, Lo's going to eat breakfast. Let's rev things up. Oh, we're getting ready for bed. Let's start to release the melatonin now. So the more you can just let your body know like, hey, here's my consistency, then it's going to start to have those anticipatory responses. Go on throughout your day. Evening comes around, try not to make your dinner your biggest meal, because we know digestion starts to slow down. I mean, there's something called gut lag in research too. So if you deal with a lot of digestive issues, what research shows is that when we travel, our circadian rhythm is disrupted. This impacts digestion, but taking it a step further, they're now discovering that circadian disruption can increase things like irritable bowel syndrome, leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability. Also, because when our circadian rhythm is disrupted, we have decreased melatonin. Melatonin helps to protect the mitochondria and leaky gut. So what am I basically telling you to do? Don't make dinner your biggest meal, right? Like, and if it is going to be and if you have to eat later in the evening, have a pre-dinner snack so you don't show up to dinner with such low blood sugar and your hunger hormones are all over the map and digestion is taxed. And then, like we had originally said, pair it with some delicious carbohydrates, like a sweet potato. I love sweet potato. Or you could do like squash, delicatata squash, whatever you kind of want. Maybe you do some rice. And then get off your phone. Right. So like, this is so hard because my husband like loves to watch TV in bed. And we're really into like the new Jake Gyllenhaal show. And as much as I want to watch it and disrupt my rhythms, I know that I'm going to feel a little bit more anxious the next day. And I generally wake up a little bit more bloated. So get your red light going, read a book. I generally tell people like, don't read something really easy, like a Colleen Hoover that's probably, like that you're into, but like not like overstimulates you. And again, watch the blue light, because the melanopsin, which tells your body like, let's start the day over.
Such good tips. Okay. And what about on the flip side for someone who has the completely opposite rhythm where they are waking up at like 3 p.m. every day and going to bed at 8 a.m.?
Yeah. So for my shift workers, so what I would say is try your best to live in alignment with that daylight rhythm. So let's say your shift is like 3 to 11, or maybe you're doing like the overnight shift. Still try to get that sunlight right away. So let's say, okay, let's just make up a person, Jane. Jane is a nurse and she starts her shift at 3 p.m., right? So she works 3 to 11, or she does the 11 to 7. And there's always constant variability. So you're leaving work at like, let's say you're leaving work at 7 a.m., right? You're like, well, what should I do? Should I get sunlight? Should I not get sunlight? I would say try to get a little bit of natural sunlight, try to sync up to a routine that you're most going to be succinct with, if that makes sense, right? So if you're working these like really intense night shifts, but you're only working 3 days a week, your routine's going to be all over the map. Try to get a little bit of that natural sunlight, try to get a little bit of something to eat. Most people, they get out of it and they're kind of wired, so they do a little bit work. And then, maybe before you're going in for your nap or your nighttime or your bedtime routine, you're having like a little bit of carbohydrates before that.
Mm,
Does that make
okay.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, do you think it's helpful for people that work night shift to use like a white light lamp while they're like working during the night? Do you think that that's necessary, or would you say like the opposite?
I feel like, so I mean, I've worked in a hospital. The lights are pretty like bright and fluorescent. So I mean, you're getting that constant blue light if you are like a night shift worker. So I mean, that could be an option from a dietary standpoint. Low, I'd say like for more of a nutritional intervention, because you're still, you're still on this circadian pattern. What I would say to like the clients I worked with one on one, who were maybe they were flight attendants or maybe most of them were nurses, is let's also not bring in food that's really difficult for your body to digest. Let's focus
Mhm.
on smoothies and soups and stews that are already partially digested, because no matter how you slice it, we're not meant to live in that setting. We're not meant to live on the opposite of our internal clock. So from that nutritional standpoint too, a lot of times most of the women I worked with were dealing with like a lot of digestive issues too. So could you bring in food that's a little bit easier in your digestive system? Smoothies, if you don't like a smoothie, could you do soups, stir fries, things where the fiber is already a little bit cooked down so it doesn't feel so difficult to digest?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a great tool. I remember a couple weeks ago you posted about doing the soup before bed, like for your dinner. And I was like, oh my God, that's such a good idea. And so I did it. I like made a chili or something for dinner. And I kid you not, I had like the best sleep that night. And I told my husband, I was like, that's it. We're eating soup for dinner every single night moving forward. It was like, you have fun with that. I'm not eating soup for dinner every night.
You guys are in California too, or I'm sure. I mean, it's hot here now too, but
Yeah.
yeah, I know. I love it. You know what, too? I don't know if you notice a difference. I always notice such a difference in my, like, I can't have soup. I mean, I could have soup every night, but probably like your husband would be like, this is enough. But like, what a difference in my HRV too, the heart rate
Oh yeah.
variability, the
Yeah.
branch of our, yeah, right? Oh, I know. Sign me up for a soup. Love a soup. I love a stir fry.
Yeah. I know, it's a great idea. And I was thinking you could even do like a cold soup, it doesn't have to necessarily be warm, but just something that's easier on your
Totally.
digestion.
Yes. And so
Yeah.
that's such a thing that helped, such a thing. Excuse my poor English, mom brain, but that was such a tool that helped me too when I was kind of like getting out of this like hardcore fasting. My appetite was basically shot. Like my dinner was my biggest meal, and then I'd always want to just naturally skip breakfast when I was fasting because I'd be so bloated the night before from eating so late at night and such big meals. Like that lighter dinner, like a soup or a stew or a stir fry, was such a helpful transitional step for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Such good tools. Okay. And these are like free, you guys. Like so many of these things, it's just adjusting like when you're eating, when you're getting sun, when you're not getting light. They're all such free tools. And that's what I love about this conversation is that you're not asking someone to go purchase a supplement. You're not telling them they have to use a red light. Maybe if they have one, okay, great. It could be a great
Totally.
resource. But I think there's such like practical strategies that anyone can implement. And as you've mentioned, have such a huge scope on how the human body is functioning that I think is so underappreciated.
And give it time, like you said though too. Like we both talked about, like hormones are they last to adapt. Like getting sunlight in 3 days straight isn't going to just like heal your thyroid, right? It's not going to like repair that axis that's been damaged. And then other little things, like we just got finished celebrating birthdays this weekend. So like I woke up, I was tired. I've got a crazy dog. I have a newborn. So I actually canceled my Pilates class and I took the girls for an extra long walk to get that extra sunlight, to get the extra nature, the extra negative ion. So it's the free tools, oh there goes Sydney, that really move the needle. So like if you're feeling tired and you're feeling sluggish, like go out for an extra long walk or maybe do an extra flow in front of your sun lamp.
Yes, such great tools. Sarah, you are one of my favorites in so many ways. And for those of you that don't know, Sarah is actually the whole reason I got my German short hair pointers because I was like, oh my God, I am just obsessed with the fact that you guys go on these long walks and I want to do that with my dogs. And like they literally have been the best motivators to walk every
I
day, first thing in the morning and sync my circadian rhythms. So if anyone needs a reason to sync your circadian rhythms more, go out and get a German short hair pointer.
my gosh, I got her like little booties in the winter when it was so cold because like she
Yeah,
was like, we have to go outside. I was like, all right, lady, but you're totally right. Like they're just the best.
they're the best, the best. Tell us where listeners can learn more about you.
You guys can find me at Nourish Thrive Glow NTG. I'm on social media. I have a website. I'm on maternity leave right now, but I post a lot of recipes. I share my dog and my daughter a lot, and us on our circadian walks. And I share free tools as well.
Amazing. And we'll put all of Sarah's info in the show notes below. And yes, she shares such great tips that are just like so realistic to your daily life. So thank you again, Sarah, so much. Really
Thank
appreciate you.
you. Of course, anything for you. This was so fun.
Me too.